So good morning, Arlene. I'm Joyce Graff. I'm with The Powerful Patient, and I have with me today Arlene Hernandez from Knoxville, Tennessee. And we're going to talk today with Arlene about education for visually impaired students. Welcome, Arlene.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Thanks. So tell us a little bit about your own background, how you managed to become a teacher of the visually impaired and why you chose to do that.
When I was growing up, we had one of the little girls that I played with a lot had a premature brother who was blind. And I would be playing at her house and this teacher would come. From the time he was very young, this was in California. He was very young and a teacher would come maybe once a week and work with him and work with the mother. And I just thought that was so interesting. So when I got into college and was trying to figure out what to do, I decided to pursue that. I got certified and worked as a teacher of visually impaired in Knoxville for about 20 years, at which time my husband retired from his job and we went to work for the Peace Corps and went overseas. I taught in the international schools overseas, but not visually impaired. I taught resource. During our tour with the Peace Corps, we spent 3 years in Washington, D.C., and at that time I taught with Prince William County in Virginia, which had a large vision program. It was a large county with a lot of students. So I saw a difference in how two different systems operate. I had never seen anything outside of Knox County before that. And got some new ideas and learned some new things and changed some of my beliefs. And then we went back overseas and then I retired. When I came back, when we finished with Peace Corps and came back to Knoxville, one of my former coworkers told me about Club Vibes. So then I met Sue Buckley and started volunteering with Club Vibes. Now my big job with Club Vibes is to do the newsletter.
Great, great. So when you started out, this was approximately when?
I started in teaching in 1972.
In 72, and the IDEA Act, the Federal Individuals with Disabilities Act, was passed in the early 70s, right?
Yes.
Right. So, and that really was the impetus for trying to mainstream visually impaired and other people with disabilities and get them into the public schools.
Yes, because at the time, this neighbor with the blind infant, there was not a school program available for him at that time, other than the state school for the blind.
Right. Was it a residential school?
Yes. Yes. So that was his only option. He did not go to it, but they continued having a teacher come into the home. And then I grew up and left. I don't know. He must have gotten into the public school system at some point.
Right. And we've fortunately fixed a lot of the underlying medical issues that caused blindness. As you said, he was premature, so he was probably over-oxygenated in the incubator, and that's very bad for retinas. But it's very good for brain power, actually. So most of those children were pretty intelligent kids, right?
Yes, most of them didn't have any other disabilities, except as the techniques for helping these very premature babies survive, as the techniques improved to help them survive from earlier and earlier, birth, I don't know what you call it, gestation periods or something.
Right.
They became, like 26-week babies were surviving. One of my former students was a 26-week baby born at 1 pound. And those babies were having more disabilities. So
Right.
as they became earlier and earlier birth dates, I guess, they were having more disabilities. intellectual disabilities, neurological disabilities, not all of them, but some of them.
And lung, I think, is the other thing that
Lung,
tends to
right,
develop late.
lung issues.
Right. So that's interesting. So one of the side effects of saving those very early babies is that they often have lifetime challenges.
Right, right. Whereas the ones, the ones that were surviving earlier, um, like you say, most did not have additional disabilities.
Right. Right. So earlier in time means that they weren't able to save as many of the tiniest babies, but
Right,
the ones that were the 7-month babies that got too much oxygen were generally otherwise okay.
right, correct.
Right. And there have been other diseases and so forth that have caused blindness in children, and most of those have been conquered, not all of them, but in any event, it's reducing the numbers of visually impaired students who are otherwise fully able.
Correct, yes. So it's more common now to have other disabilities along with the blindness. And often the blindness or visual impairment is not the major disability.
So we were looking at some statistics before we began that showed that the numbers in the schools have not changed a great deal since they began keeping track in the 1970s. But according to some of the footnotes in that research, the number of visually impaired students that are reported to the American Printing House for the Blind, one of the big resources for materials for students, the number reported to them is double what you see in the IDEA numbers and the federal counts of how many students there are in the school. And according to those numbers, there are 36 nationally in 2018 in public schools. So 36 visually impaired students scattered all over the United States says to me that that's very challenging for the school system.
Yes, I'm not sure if that number is national because just between Knox County and Virginia, we would probably come up with more than 36 just blind kids. I wonder if that's more of a local number. Or,
I have no idea. We'll have to look into that more. But in
but
any
you're
event,
correct.
it's a smaller number and it's more challenging for the school systems.
Yes, you're correct because smaller school systems can't provide, often they can't provide a teacher for one visually impaired or blind student, or they have to contract with another system, or um, sometimes the teacher has to travel quite a distance and only comes once a week. So they cannot provide adequate services.
The other thing that was in the footnotes for the data is that um, when you sign up for IDEA services, you have to put yourself into one disability category, and it's either visually impaired or perhaps multiply handicapped. Or if one of your other handicapping conditions is more severe, maybe you've put yourself under physically disabled and maybe you're legally blind, but you can see some. So there's a whole mix in there that's behind that data. And they're saying that 50 to 75% of visually impaired students now have, in addition, some additional disability.
Correct, right. So the population has shifted from the premature children as that has decreased, multi-disabilities has increased.
Right. So again, challenges for the school system. So
Yes.
we don't want to just look like we're complaining that the visually impaired students are not getting what they need. We understand that the school systems are under a lot of pressure to do this too. And we're trying to figure out how we can fill the gaps and make sure that each student gets what he or she needs. But that can be quite different.
It's a real challenge. Sometimes to figure out what the child needs, even to figure out which is their primary disability that most affects their education.
Right.
So, that has to be determined, and a service program has to be designed to meet that child's needs.
I understand that one of the tasks of a teacher of the visually impaired is to do that assessment. So how do you go about doing that assessment and figuring out what the child needs?
It's usually done when the child is first referred, usually around the age of 3 for preschool, when they're eligible for preschool. They'll be assessed not just by a teacher of visually impaired, by several, a speech teacher, a teacher of visually impaired, and maybe several other teachers. Um, so the teacher of visually impaired will look at how the child functions with their vision. How does the vision impact what they can do, what they do day to day? We'll try to determine an estimate of an acuity. We'll have an eye doctor's report. And then we'll give the child just different activities just to see what they can do. How close do they have to get? Can they see things? You put things around the room and see what things they can see. If they have no vision, how have they adapted to their no vision? You try to place them on a scale of normal child development and see how they're developing compared to a normal child. And it's different with every child.
Right.
We start by looking at the eye report before they ever come to see what their eye condition is. But sometimes the eye report doesn't have a lot of information because the eye specialist has had trouble assessing their vision also at a very young age.
Right. There are some ways that they can do a passive refraction, they call
Yes.
it. So the child doesn't have to tell you that the E is pointing up in north, south, east, or west, which
Right.
they would ask an adult who is not literate to do. But they can just use a machine to figure that out.
Yes, they do have that. And then things such as, you find some things a child's familiar with, like a toy car, a banana, and things, and show them to the child and let the child see if the child can identify them. This is a child with some vision. And then scatter them around and see if the child can find them, to see how far away the child can find them, things like that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
So it's kind of informal for the young child that we're just evaluating for starting school.
Okay, so one of the things that I've been hearing from some of the parents is that sometimes the school system will just hire someone to be with the student and help them verbally to get the questions, tell the answers, and so forth, and so that the child winds up doing well in school, but not always being literate. They don't know how to spell, or they don't know how to type, or something like that. So can you tell us the origin of that methodology? Is having a companion cheaper than hiring a teacher of the visually impaired, or what's
Um,
the balance?
I need to say that was never done in our system. Um, we never hired a full-time assistant for any blind child. Um, Sometimes the vision teacher or the TVI would end up spending half a day there, quite a bit of time. But the logistics, I think, of having the full-time assistant was that the child is in a regular classroom and the regular classroom teacher doesn't have time to tend to the blind child's needs. And so this was just a way to solve keeping the child in the regular classroom, but not burdening the regular teacher. And we always saw it as a real disservice. And the only time we ever did something like that was if, like, a child is in our a class is going to be doing something. I know I had a girl in chemistry, and occasionally we would have someone go into chemistry with her if they were doing something maybe that would be dangerous to her, but just on a as needed basis. not on a regular basis. Even the school system in Virginia did not have full-time assistants with any of the students. But I think systems that didn't have as big a program, that's where that was seen more, where systems didn't have the ability to assign a vision teacher for 2 or 3 hours a day to one child, or didn't have a vision teacher. Their solution was to hire an assistant.
Right. So can you give us an idea of, let's say that you've just gotten a student who entering the high school and they're otherwise perfectly able, but they're blind. And what would you do to try to figure out what this child needs?
Well, I'd look at what the child's been doing up until then to high school, what their level, of functioning and everything is, assuming, like you said, they have no other needs. So you look at what the classes the child is going to take, and what, like if they're going to take algebra, they need to learn more Braille skills, Nemeth code algebra skills. You just mainly look at what the child's going to take and what kind of support they're going to need to be independent in the classroom in that field. But as the child gets older, you try to pull back and give less and less support.
So tell us about that. What's the rationale for doing that?
Well, because the child is eventually going to leave.
Right.
And you want the child to go on to college and employment without depending on an assistant. And so hopefully they've learned, a lot of their skills by the time they get to high school. But like I say, if they're going to take, they're going to take algebra, geometry, there are a lot of new Braille symbols and things that are going to be involved. So you have to still see the student and teach those. Also, you need to provide support if they're going to do a high school research paper. The skills. Now these days it's searching the internet and knowing how to do that. When I had high school students, it was, we would get a volunteer reader and the child would learn to direct the reader. This is what I need you to read for me and things like that. So it's changed a little bit, but it's still, you have to look at what new skills are going to be involved in what that child wants to study and decide how you're going to provide the teaching of those skills.
Right. So what's the importance of Braille and when would you start teaching Braille?
Day one. You start teaching Braille. Even in preschool, you start teaching pre-Braille skills. In kindergarten, when all the other kids are learning, well, now most of the kids know the alphabet before kindergarten, but the blind kid does the same activities that the rest of the class does, but with his Braille sheets.
Okay, so we should expect every child who's 8 years old to be doing what all children do at 8 years old, whether or not they're visually impaired.
Correct. Yes.
Great. And so that's a good responsibility for the teacher, but it's also a good responsibility for the parents.
That's where part of the job of the TVI. A lot of times the parents don't foresee that their child is going to be independent and grow up to lead an independent life. They see, how can my child ever take care of themselves? How can they cook? How can they do their laundry and stuff? They don't see that. So part of the job is to teach the parent to expect their blind or visually impaired child to do everything that the other child does, maybe in a different way, but they still need to follow the same development steps and do the same things that all the other children do.
You know, it's interesting. What's popping into my head is that among my blind friends, and I have a number of friends who are blind, the ones that I see as most independent and successful have been the ones from large families where their siblings gave them no quarter. You know, they would uh, challenge them to climb a tree and then go away and let them figure out how to get down, or, you know, something like that. And, and so they learned from an early age to cope with whatever the situation was.
Yeah, I saw a quote um, years ago um, about talking about not not restricting a blind child's activities and saying, you know, a skinned knee or even a broken arm heals a lot faster than a life of inactivity.
Yes, yes.
So,
So as parents, we have to learn not to be too helpful.
and to let the child fall, you know, let the child, you know, I mean, not have serious injury, but to you know, learn what happens if you do this, you know,
Right,
and have the experiences. You know,
right.
a blind child can even learn to ride a bike. Several of my blind students could ride a bike. One little boy, his mother, there was an alley next to their house, and his mother put a trash cans at each end of the alley, and he rode until he hit the trash can, and turned around and went back.
Very good, very good. But stacking things and even understanding color for children who have some vision, it's important to develop all of those skills.
Exactly. Yes. Yes.
So if a child is partially sighted, would you start Braille early as well?
Well, you have to depend if they're going to need Braille.
Okay,
You do an evaluation to see how well they can function with print. Maybe they can see print and maybe they can identify letters, but if the letters have to be 3 inches tall and it takes them a minute to identify them, that's not efficient. So
right.
then you would do Braille. But if they can function with print using modifications, magnifiers, closed circuit TVs, or you know, enlarging devices, then you go with the print.
Right, but if the prognosis is such that the visual impairment is likely to get worse, then that might
Then
color your decision.
then you yes, then you we would start Braille early. Um, some students you do both print and Braille,
Right,
and sometimes let the child decide which works best for them. But if the prognosis is for decreasing vision, then definitely Braille is a important thing to introduce.
so even if you don't read books in Braille, Braille is very useful for labeling and other kinds of things.
Yes,
So knowing at least a little bit of Braille is usually very helpful.
and even someone who loses vision older in life or later in life. I had a student who lost his vision when he was 15 in high school, just suddenly. And so obviously he is not going to read his textbooks in Braille.
Right,
Um, so for him, Braille was needed to access algebra, to do math. It's very difficult to do math just auditorily. You really need to see it, you know, with Braille. So we started him with Nemeth code. That was what he learned. And then, like you say, enough Braille to label things and to read the elevator, things like that.
right. So even though there are technical gadgets now that can help you with a lot of those things,
Uh-huh.
a little bit of Braille is helpful because it supports your independence.
Yes, yes. And, you know, to have some knowledge of Braille is important.
Right, like my husband couldn't tell the brown suit from the black suit, and so I would label them with French knots, you know.
Oh, yes, I've heard of that. Uh-huh. Yeah,
So you can do a lot with Braille that you,
labor intensive.
yeah, but
Because
it
now
works.
the smartphone would tell him.
That's right. Now you can use your smartphone to see whether it's black or brown.
Well,
Right.
this same student that I was telling you about, when he first started, uh, learning living skills and things, he had to label cans and packages and things, but no more. I asked him recently if he still uses Braille to label anything, and he said no, that, the smartphone
Yeah.
can identify anything he needs.
Yeah, because smartphones can also read those UPC codes, the QR codes that they put on the cans and the
Uh-huh.
barcodes, and say, this is peaches, it's not green beans.
And it even tells them how many calories it has and the nutrition information, more than they want to know.
Right. So that brings up an interesting point. So telephones and phones are a little bit suspect in schools anyway. Not all schools allow kids to have smartphones in the schools. But when should a parent really start thinking about this child might benefit from the technical support of a smartphone, not just the telephone capability?
Yes, of course, that's fairly recent, the things that the smartphones do so much. But if I were working now, I would encourage it in early elementary school, where it can do so much for the child. Like I say, even identify colors, identify um, objects. Is if there's something you don't know what it is, what you're looking at, you can access this app called Be My Eyes, where there's somebody who will look at it, look at the picture of whatever you're looking at and tell you what it is. I think a young child can benefit from a lot of the functions of a smartphone.
Interesting. Okay. So there's a wide diversity even within the visually impaired community. There are people who are just legally blind, 2,200. So you see something close up as if you were looking at it from across the street. And so you don't have very good definition on it. But nonetheless, they have what's called travel vision. And so they can get around and not fall off the curb or anything like that. And then there's everything between that and total blindness. So what about mobility skills? What do the schools do with mobility skills?
Well, they start also, as soon as the child starts school, they start working on mobility skills and work on it all the way through school, to teach them to be safe and to eventually to travel in their community. The older kids are taken, out in the neighborhood, into the city, ride buses, all the skills that they will need to function independently when they leave school.
And much of that is provided in the states by their various commissions for the blind, right? So the school system itself doesn't necessarily need to have the skills to do that. They can bring in someone from the commission.
No, the school system hires the mobility instructor or contracts with them until the child is out of school. At least in Tennessee, the state would take over after the child is out of school.
I see. So while they're under 18, while they're in the school system, it's up to the school to do that, and then
Yeah.
the commission picks up after high school.
Correct. At
Okay.
least in Tennessee. I don't know if every place is the same.
Right. So a lot of this is administered by the states, and parents would need to check for whatever services are available near them.
Right. And what services they're entitled to. That is an important thing for parents, especially if they don't have a good vision services where they live, is to check and find out what should be provided to them, what kind of equipment should be provided, what kind of instruction, to be sure they're getting what they should be getting.
Right. And that the focus should be not simply on succeeding in school, but as you say, preparing them for real life and the workplace and being as independent as possible.
Correct. Mhm.
Right. So help me understand um, what students need to know in in just preparing for that independence. What can we do to support them in getting to where they need to be? What do the school systems need, or what do the parents need to do?
Well, in addition to academics, they need to know how to take care of themselves, how to perform their daily living needs, cooking, laundry, shopping, those activities. But um, one of the things now the school needs to really prepare kids for is technology. They need to be very skilled in technology to function in the world, just like any sighted person needs. You really can't probably get much of a job without knowledge of technology. Um, so that's one thing they need to have good skills for to be able to get a job when they leave school.
Right. So we've just crossed a whole range of activities that the school and the parents are going to need to help provide for this student. And realistically, with the smaller and smaller number of visually impaired students, that's an economic challenge for a school system.
Yes, educating a blind or low vision student is very expensive, um, especially, as more technology comes and technology keeps changing. And the child needs to be taught the technology. It has to be bought for the child.
Right, so there's buying the equipment, but there's also, as you say, the specialized training. And so more and more it's beginning to sound like we need multiple people here. One teacher of the visually impaired can't be the jack of all trades that is needed here to do all these things. So if you were the superintendent of schools and trying to design the optimal system at this point, what would you envision as being the right cast of players?
Well, you're right. The TVI can't do it all um, in this day and age. There's too much expertise needed. So you need a TVI. You need an orientation and mobility specialist, whether the system hires one or contracts with, depending on how many students need the service. Um, but now it's becoming apparent that there needs to be a special technology person, a person who is so skilled in technology that they can teach, different systems to different students. The computer and screen readers to the blind students and even low vision students, enlarging software and things that they need. The TVI cannot become an expert in learning, all of these different systems. So a school system, if they have enough of a need, they can hire their own technology expert or have one of their staff become one by getting training and learning, very well how to use the different programs that are needed. Or they can contract with a technology expert.
So some outsourcing is probably a smart idea.
Oh, definitely. It,
Yeah.
and the technology keeps changing. So you can't just have someone get trained and then think that it's done, because it's not.
That's right. That's right. And sometimes even when you call the manufacturer, they don't know the many ways that a visually impaired person is going to try to use this device. I know I've had that experience with the Amazon Alexa people. They're very good up to a point, but depending on the visual impairment and the age of the person that you're dealing with, they may not be able to answer your questions. So it really is good if you have somebody who's very expert and has that perspective of the visually impaired person trying to use this device.
Right, right. They have to be an expert. It just can't be the TVI who has, you know, taught herself how to use JAWS and knows the basics. They need to learn a lot more than the basics.
And it occurs to me that that's actually a good model for someone launching off into the workplace, because they're not going to have the TVI at their elbow to help them figure things out. They'll need to know if there are resources in the community that can help them figure it out.
Yes, they do need to know, you know, what the community offers to, you know, the Department of Vocational Rehab or whatever else is available. They do need to know about the community services.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Are there other things that you would particularly like to say to parents who are listening, who have themselves tried to be the jack of all trades?
Yes, well, just learn, explore the internet. There's so much available. There are some wonderful online um, programs for teaching a lot of the technology. The parent also needs to become familiar with it. So they need to start learning when their child is young, and just expect that your child will be just like any other child. Expose your child to all the experiences that other children are exposed to. Not that they're going to, you know, learn to do everything another child, but they need to understand what different experiences are that other children are doing. So don't hold back.
Thank you. And one of the pluses of mainstreaming kids is social, learning to interact with their peers and to get along in teams and understand the various pressures that they're going to be on when they get out into the workplace and into the real world. So they shouldn't be shy to let them stumble a little bit socially as well.
Exactly. Yeah.
Great.
You know, and you know, they should be inviting kids over to their house and um, having the same experiences, not thinking because they're blind they can't do things. It's
Yeah, because
not the
blind
case.
blind kids can do lots of things, and we should challenge them to live up to their potential as we do
Exactly.
all children.
Yeah.
So thank you so much, Arlene. I appreciate it, and enjoy your beautiful day in Knoxville.
Yes, thank you. You too.
Okay.